There's a question that historians lower their voices to ask. Not in conference halls, not in published papers with footnotes and peer review, but in the margins of conversations, over cold coffee, when the recorder is off and the academic armor comes loose. The question is this: what if he had just had more time? What if the man who understood the disease better than anyone, the one who had spent decades reading the empire's own secret confessions, had been given 5 years instead of 15 months? Would the largest country on Earth still exist? Would the entire architecture of the late 20th century look different? Would we be living in a world that never happened? This is not a story about nostalgia. It is not a rehabilitation project or a political argument. It is something more unsettling than either of those things. It is a story about a man who saw clearly in a system designed to blind its own leaders, and what happened when that clarity finally reached the top, too late, too briefly, and against every institutional force that wanted it gone. His name was Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, and almost everything you think you know about him is either incomplete or wrong. Forget the image. Forget the gray specter of Soviet bureaucracy, the cold functionary in the ill-fitting suit, the KGB chief who was supposed to represent everything mechanical and merciless about the Soviet state. That caricature is real in its details and false in its meaning. Yes, he ran the secret services for 15 years. Yes, he was feared. Yes, the files he kept on the powerful were thick and precise. But here is what the caricature misses entirely. The man was one of the very few people in the entire Soviet system who actually knew what was happening to it. That is a rarer thing than it sounds. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had constructed one of the most elaborate systems of institutional self-deception in human history. This was not a conspiracy. It was not even intentional exactly. It was the natural result of a bureaucratic culture in which bad news traveled upward only after being transformed into acceptable news. Factory managers submitted production figures that were optimistic. Regional party secretaries forwarded reports that showed improvement. Ministry officials compiled summaries that confirmed the general direction of progress. By the time information reached the top of the pyramid, it had been laundered so thoroughly that it no longer resembled anything that was actually happening on the ground. The result was a leadership class that governed by hallucination. Walk into a grocery store in Moscow in 1981. The shelves offered a kind of archaeological exhibit, products that existed in the system's memory, but had stopped existing in its reality. Meat was theoretical. Certain vegetables appeared seasonally, like rumors. Basic consumer goods required a personal network, a favor economy, the right cousin in the right warehouse. Citizens had developed an entire parallel economy of informal exchange that the official statistics not only failed to measure, but actively denied the existence of. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Leonid Brezhnev presided over official banquets. Brezhnev by this point was less a leader than a living symbol, a breathing, metal-wearing monument to the system's inability to renew itself. His speeches were delivered from texts he sometimes could not read without assistance. Decisions were made in his name by people who had learned to work around the ceremonial weight of his office. He was, in the most precise sense, a man playing the role of the man in charge. And around him, an entire apparatus of courtiers, deputies, and regional barons had constructed their careers on the maintenance of this performance. The system was not governing the country. It was governing the appearance of the country. And almost everyone at the top had such a deep personal investment in that appearance. Their careers, their privileges, their dachas, their children's positions, that even those who privately suspected the truth had every incentive to perform the official reality. Almost everyone. Andropov received different reports. This is the fact that everything else turns on. As chairman of the KGB, he sat at the intersection of two information streams that almost no one else in the Soviet leadership had access to simultaneously. The first was foreign intelligence, The actual assessments of how the USSR appeared from outside, how its economy compared to Western counterparts, what foreign analysts genuinely believed about its trajectory when they were not being diplomatic. This information was not always accurate, but it was not filtered through Soviet institutional optimism. It came from people whose job was to be correct, not encouraging. The second stream was domestic surveillance, not in the crude sense of monitoring dissidents, but in the broader sense of a vast network that reported on the actual texture of Soviet life. What people were saying in private, what shortages looked like in which cities, where the informal economy had grown so large it had effectively replaced the official one, where local party organizations had become so corrupt that they functioned as extraction operations rather than governance structures. These two streams, read together, produced a portrait of the Soviet Union that was almost unrecognizable compared to the official version. And Andropov had been reading this portrait for 15 years while climbing toward the position where he might finally be able to act on it. He was not a sentimentalist about what he read. He was not horrified. Exactly. Horror implies surprise. He had known for a long time. What he carried was something colder and more strategic, a clear-eyed assessment of how much time remained, how much damage had accumulated, and what would need to happen if the system was going to survive contact with its own reality. He was 68 years old when he finally reached the top. His kidneys were failing. He knew he was not well. He also knew that the window, if there was a window, was narrow and closing. What does it mean to inherit a country that does not know it is dying? This is the question Andropov walked into in November of 1982, when Brezhnev's death finally ended the long theatrical performance of Soviet stability. The mourning was genuine in places. Brezhnev had ruled for 18 years, and there's always grief at the end of an era, even a stagnant one. But in certain offices, in certain conversations, there was something else alongside the grief. A recognition that the moment had arrived. That the man who had been reading the real reports for 15 years was now in a position to do something about what they said. The country he inherited was not the country its official statistics described. It was a nation of extraordinary human intelligence and scientific capability, sitting on some of the largest natural resource reserves on the planet, governed by a machine so encrusted with institutional rot that it could no longer translate any of those advantages into the basic things a population needed to live well. The gap between Soviet potential and Soviet reality was not an accident. It was the achievement of decades of systematic misgovernance, the accumulated result of promoting loyalty over competence, punishing accurate reporting, and building a bureaucracy whose primary function had become its own perpetuation. Andropov understood all of this with a specificity that no one else at the top of Soviet power possessed. He had 15 months. The clock was already running. What follows is the story of what he did with that time, and what it cost him. It is also a story about a question with no clean answer. Whether any single person, no matter how clearly they see, can outrun the institutional gravity of a system determined to survive exactly as it is. The answer, as it turns out, says something important not just about the Soviet Union, but about every organization, every government, every structure that has ever learned to protect itself from the truth. The answer begins in the corridors of a dying empire, in the early hours of November morning, when a quiet man from the intelligence services sat down at the desk of the most powerful office in the communist world and started making a list. There's a management principle so obvious it is almost never followed. If you inherit a broken system, the first thing you must change is not the rules. It is not the incentives, not the structure, not the ideology. The first thing you must change is the people, because the people who thrived inside the broken system are not neutral instruments waiting to be redirected. They're the system. They carry it inside them. They will execute your new rules in the spirit of the old ones, file your new reports in the language of the old lies, and smile at you across the table, while making sure that nothing you want actually happens. Andropov understood this at a level that was almost biological. He had spent 15 years reading the files. He knew which regional party secretary was skimming agricultural procurement figures. He knew which ministry official had a son placed in a position that required qualifications the son did not possess. He knew which factory director had been filing production numbers that bore a poetic rather than literal relationship to actual output. He had not collected this information for blackmail. That is the cartoonish version of how intelligence services work. He had collected it because information was the only reliable map of a country that had learned to lie about itself. And now, for the first time, he had the authority to act on the map. The first wave came fast. Within weeks of taking power, Andropov initiated a series of personnel changes that moved through the Soviet bureaucracy like a cold wind through an office that had been sealed shut for decades. Ministers were replaced. Regional party bosses who had held their positions since the Brezhnev years, some of them for longer than many of their subordinates had been adults, were informed that their service was no longer required. The replacements were younger, in many cases technically trained, selected not for their ideological credentials or their personal connections to the old networks, but for something the Soviet system had long treated as optional: demonstrated competence. In the Interior Ministry, senior officials who had built comfortable arrangements with the very criminal enterprises they were supposed to be investigating found themselves facing the specific, documented evidence of those arrangements. The anti-corruption campaigns were not theatrical. They were surgical. They used real files, real evidence, real names. Tens of thousands of officials at various levels of the system were removed, investigated, or reassigned in the first year alone. The country noticed. This was itself remarkable. The Soviet population had developed a profound and rational cynicism about official announcements of reform. Promises of improvement were background noise, like traffic. But this felt different. The arrests were real. The dismissals were real. In the bread lines, in the apartment corridors, in the factory break rooms where Soviet citizens conducted their actual political conversations, there is something that had not existed for a long time: the tentative, cautious, easily frightened sense that something might actually be changing. But Andropov was not interested only in removing people. That was the precondition, not the goal. What he was working toward, quietly, without public fanfare, without the grand ideological declarations that Soviet reform had always wrapped itself in before going nowhere, was something considerably more radical than an anti-corruption campaign. He was attempting to rewire the fundamental logic by which Soviet enterprises operated. The concept was not new. It had been debated in Soviet economic circles since at least the 1960s, when a group of reformist economists had proposed something called Kozraskit, a system of enterprise accountability in which factories and production units would be evaluated not on whether they had met their plan targets, but on whether they had generated actual economic value, whether their products could be sold, whether their costs were real, whether the numbers they reported corresponded to something that existed in the physical world. This sounds unremarkable. It sounds, in fact, like a description of how any normal organization is supposed to function. But inside the Soviet system, it was a genuine revolution in miniature. The entire architecture of Soviet enterprise management had been built around the plan target, a number assigned from above that defined success regardless of whether achieving it produced anything anyone actually needed. A factory that produced 10,000 pairs of boots that fell apart in the first month had succeeded if it met its target. A factory that produced 8,000 pairs of excellent boots had failed. The incentive was not quality, not efficiency, not customer satisfaction. The incentive was the number. Andropov wanted to change the incentive. The pilot programs were limited, deliberately so. He was not attempting to dismantle Soviet economic organization in one gesture. He was a systems thinker not a revolutionary, and he understood that a system with this many interdependencies could not be restructured all at once without catastrophic disruption. The approach was the same one a careful surgeon uses. Test the incision, watch the response, expand only when you understand what you're dealing with. The results of the early pilots were, by Soviet standards, startling. Enterprises operating under the new accountability framework showed measurable improvements in output quality and modest, but real gains in efficiency. More importantly, they began generating accurate information about their own performance, because the incentive to lie had been, partially and carefully, removed. While this was happening domestically, Andropov was conducting a parallel operation in foreign policy that almost no one outside a very small circle of Soviet officials knew about. Afghanistan was bleeding the country, not in the way that Western commentary described it. The military situation was brutal, but manageable in the narrow sense that Soviet forces were not losing in any conventional meaning of the word. What Afghanistan was doing was something more insidious and harder to quantify. It was consuming resources that a structurally strained economy could not spare. It was generating a steady current of loss. Young men, equipment, political capital that flowed through the system with no visible endpoint. It was the kind of commitment that a healthy empire might have absorbed without catastrophic damage, but that a declining one could not afford. Andropov had opposed the original intervention. This was documented, known within the relevant circles, filed in the same careful archives that he had spent his career maintaining. He had argued against it before it happened and understood its costs more clearly than almost anyone now that it was underway. Through back channels, discreet, deniable, carefully insulated from the official foreign policy apparatus that was too large and too leaky to be trusted with sensitive exploratory conversations, he began probing whether an exit existed. Not a retreat in the humiliating sense that Soviet political culture could not absorb, but a structured conclusion that could be presented as a completion of objectives. These conversations were preliminary. They were also more serious than anything the Soviet leadership had attempted before on this question. He was not pursuing them out of idealism. He was pursuing them out of arithmetic. And then there was Gorbachev. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was 51 years old when Andropov came to power, the youngest full member of the Politburo, a man with a law degree and an agricultural background and a reputation as someone who could be spoken to directly without the layers of performance that surrounded most Soviet officials of his generation. Andropov had been watching him for years, not with the warmth of a mentor toward a favorite student, but with the colder assessment of a strategist identifying a necessary instrument. The relationship between them was not sentimental. Andropov did not promote Gorbachev because he liked him, though the evidence suggests he respected him. He promoted him because Gorbachev was the most viable candidate for the role that Andropov understood he might not live to complete himself. The kidney disease was advancing. The time frame was narrowing. If the work was going to continue past his own capacity to direct it, it needed someone positioned to carry it forward. What Andropov could not have fully calculated, what perhaps no one could have calculated, was what Gorbachev would do with that positioning once the constraints of Andropov's framework were removed. That is a story for the third part. But the choice itself was not accidental, not political, not the result of factional maneuvering in the way that Soviet leadership succession usually worked. It was a deliberate act of institutional design by a man who was thinking past his own survival. That is an unusual thing in any system. By the end of his first year in power, Andropov had accomplished more structural change than the entire preceding decade of Soviet governance. The personnel transformation alone had altered the composition of the upper bureaucracy in ways that would take years to fully map. The economic pilots were producing data that challenged the foundational assumptions of Soviet enterprise management. The foreign policy backchannels were open and producing preliminary intelligence about what a negotiated resolution in Afghanistan might look like. He had also made enemies at a rate that no previous Soviet leader had risked. This is the thing about operating on a system from inside it. Every person you remove was someone's patron, someone's protector, someone's source of advancement. Every factory director who discovered that his falsified reports were now a liability rather than a career asset had a network of relationships that were also now threatened. Every regional party boss who found his comfortable tenure suddenly conditional had people who depended on his continued tenure. The resistance had not yet become visible. It was too early, and Andropov was still too strong, and the fear of what he knew about everyone was still too fresh. But it was organizing, quietly, in the way that institutional self-preservation always organizes. Not through conspiracy exactly, but through the shared understanding of people who recognize a common threat and begin, without explicit coordination, to act in ways that serve their shared interest in the threat's removal. The files on his desk were getting heavier. The reports were getting slower. And in a residence outside Moscow, connected to a machine that was doing work his kidneys could no longer do, the man who had finally reached the position where he could use what he knew was running out of the one thing that no intelligence file could provide. Time. He had perhaps 6 months left. He knew it. He worked anyway. There's a specific kind of resistance that is almost impossible to fight. Not the resistance of open opposition. That is manageable, even in an authoritarian system, because it has a face and a location and can be addressed directly. Not the resistance of public protest or factional challenge or ideological argument. Those forms of resistance require courage from the people practicing them, and courage is a limited resource that power can exhaust. The resistance that is almost impossible to fight is the kind that wears the face of compliance. It looks like bureaucratic delay. A report that was requested in 10 days arrives in 25, with an apologetic note about staffing complications. An order that was issued clearly comes back implemented in a form that is technically consistent with the original instruction, but functionally useless. The letter honored, the spirit quietly strangled. A personnel appointment goes through the proper channels and emerges at the other end subtly modified. The candidate shifted to a position that carries the right title but none of the actual authority. Documents disappear into review processes and emerge months later, amended in small ways that collectively reverse their original purpose. None of this is illegal. None of it is even technically insubordinate. Every person involved can produce a file showing that they followed procedure, respected the chain of command, processed the relevant paperwork in the appropriate sequence. The system appears to be functioning. The machine appears to be running. And yet somehow, with a consistency that cannot be coincidental, the outcomes are different from what was intended. This is what Andropov faced in his final months. Not a coup, not a confrontation, a slow, distributed, institutionally perfect act of suffocation. The people doing it did not think of themselves as saboteurs. This is important to understand because it explains why the resistance was so effective and so durable. The officials who delayed reports, who modified appointments, who processed reform directives through interpretive frameworks that neutralized their intent. Most of them were not acting from ideology or from any conscious political program. They were acting from the oldest and most powerful of bureaucratic instincts, self-preservation. Andropov's reforms threatened them not because of what they believed, but because of what they had. The regional party secretary who had held his position for 14 years had a life built on that position. The access it provided, the arrangements it enabled, the network of mutual obligations it sat at the center of. The ministry official whose department's figures had always been creative rather than accurate had a career built on the tolerance of that creativity. The factory director whose production numbers had been optimistic for a decade had subordinates and family connections, and a lifestyle that depended on the continuation of a system that treated the appearance of output as equivalent to actual output. These people were not evil. They were, in the most precise sense, the system, and the system was defending itself through them without any of them needing to be consciously aware that they were participating in a defense. The irony was devastating. The same institutional self-preservation mechanisms that Andropov had studied for 15 years as a diagnostician were now being deployed against him as a patient. He had read the files on how the system protected itself. Now he was experiencing the protection from the inside. By the autumn of 1983, the machinery of delay had become sophisticated enough that Andropov was reportedly receiving intelligence about the obstruction itself, reports on the reports that were not arriving, assessments of the assessments that were being quietly modified. He understood precisely what was happening and precisely why. Understanding did not help. The same information asymmetry that had made him powerful in his former role now worked against him. He knew what was happening in the system. The system had learned that he knew and had adjusted to ensure that knowing did not translate into changing. He was also dying. The kidney disease had progressed to the point where the medical situation was no longer a background condition, but a primary constraint on everything. He was conducting government from a residence in Kontsevo, connected to dialysis equipment, receiving visitors in a context that required careful management of his physical presentation. The Soviet system had a long tradition of concealing the medical condition of its leaders. Brezhnev's decline had been managed through a combination of official silence and careful stage management for years, and the same machinery was now deployed for Andropov, though in his case with his own full awareness and, reportedly, his impatient contempt for the necessity. He continued working. The accounts from people who saw him in this period describe a man whose mental clarity had not diminished, whose analytical sharpness, whose precision in identifying the gap between what was reported and what was real remained intact even as his physical capacity contracted. He reviewed documents. He issued directives. He continued the project of personnel transformation where the channels had not yet been fully obstructed. But the radius of effective action was shrinking. The resistance that could not be confronted directly was accumulating its effects. And the clock that had been running since November of 1982 was approaching an end that everyone in the relevant circles understood was coming, and that many of them, in the privacy of their institutional calculations, had begun to plan around. He died on the 9th of February, 1984. 15 months and 3 days after taking power, long enough to demonstrate what was possible. Not long enough to make it irreversible. The transition to Konstantin Ustinovich Chernenko was, in historical terms, one of the most dispiriting succession events of the 20th century. Not because Chernenko was monstrous, but because he was the opposite of that. He was a man of the system in the purest sense. A party functionary of the old school, a Brezhnev loyalist, a figure whose entire career had been built on the maintenance of precisely the institutional arrangements that Andropov had been dismantling. He was also, at 72, already visibly unwell at the time of his appointment. The Soviet leadership had responded to 15 months of reforming energy by selecting a caretaker. A living signal to the bureaucracy that the disruption was over, that the arrangements could be rebuilt, that the files could go back to being comfortable rather than dangerous. The reform programs did not end dramatically. They faded. The economic pilots that had been showing early results lost their institutional support and were gradually absorbed back into the standard framework of plan target management. The personnel changes that had been implemented held in some cases. Not every appointment Andropov had made could be reversed without embarrassment, but the pipeline of new appointments dried up and the old networks began the patient work of reconstructing themselves around whoever remained. The back-channel foreign policy conversations about Afghanistan were quietly discontinued. The machine exhaled. Gorbachev waited. He had been positioned carefully, elevated deliberately, Given a proximity to the center of power that survived both the transition to Chernenko and the quiet reversal of almost everything Andropov had built. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they understand that time is moving in their direction. He watched the Chernenko interlude with the particular attention of a man who was studying what not to do as much as what to do. When Chernenko died in March of 1985, 13 months after taking power, another brief and fading tenure, Gorbachev moved. He was the youngest member of the Politburo, the most vigorous, the most clearly oriented toward the recognition that something had to change. He carried with him the legacy of the man who had positioned him, the diagnostic clarity that Andropov had modeled, the understanding that the system's self-deception was terminal. But he drew different conclusions about what the diagnosis required. Andropov had believed in managed transformation, change conducted from inside the existing structure, using the tools of the system against its own pathologies, preserving the architecture while replacing the people and adjusting the incentives. It was the approach of a man who had spent his career inside the machine and believed, with the informed confidence of deep familiarity, that the machine could be reformed without being destroyed. Gorbachev pursued acceleration, openness, a different theory about the relationship between the system and the society it governed, one that involved bringing the society into the conversation, releasing information, allowing a degree of public participation in the diagnosis that Andropov would almost certainly have considered dangerously premature. Whether Gorbachev was right or wrong is a question that history has answered with an outcome, but not with a verdict. The system did not survive his reforms. The country did not survive his reforms. Whether this means the reforms failed, or whether it means the system was already too far gone to survive any honest reckoning with its own condition. That is the argument that has not been resolved and perhaps cannot be. What would Andropov have done differently? This is the question that cannot be answered, but cannot be avoided. The evidence suggests he would have moved more slowly and more precisely. He would have insulated the economic experiments more carefully from the institutional resistance, creating facts on the ground before the opposition could organize. He would have used the information he possessed about the obstructors to remove them before they could coordinate. He would have managed the foreign policy exits, Afghanistan first, then perhaps a broader recalibration of the Soviet relationship with Eastern Europe in ways that preserve the appearance of strength while reducing the actual cost. He would, in other words, have attempted the Chinese path, the managed modernization that Deng Xiaoping was already executing in Beijing with a combination of economic pragmatism and political authoritarianism. Change the economy, preserve the party, move carefully enough that the beneficiaries of the old system can be transformed into beneficiaries of a new one before they realize what has happened to them. Whether this would have worked is the question that sits at the center of everything. The Chinese path required time, required a leadership healthy enough to execute a multi-decade project, required an institutional culture that could absorb economic experimentation without generalizing it into political challenge. The Soviet Union had different conditions, a more urbanized and educated population, a deeper tradition of ideological rigidity, a bureaucracy more extensively entrenched, and whether those different conditions would have defeated even the most careful managed modernization is something no one can know. What we know is that the path was not attempted. 15 months was not enough time to create the irreversible facts that would have constrained every successor. The window opened, and then it closed, and the man who had spent his entire career preparing to use it ran out of time before he could. There is a word in Russian, nedoskazanost. It translates roughly as the state of something left unsaid, the weight of the words that were never spoken, the shape of the sentence that was never finished. It is a concept that appears frequently in Russian literature, in poetry especially, as a way of describing the particular kind of loss that comes not from destruction, but from incompletion. Andropov's tenure is nedoskazanost in political form, not a tragedy of catastrophic failure, but something quieter and in some ways harder to absorb. The outline of a sentence that was interrupted before anyone could hear how it ended. The country that might have existed on the other side of that sentence is not knowable. It lives only in the conditional tense, in the lowered voices of historians over cold coffee, in the margins where the real questions are kept. What we are left with is the question itself. And the question, as it turns out, is still alive. Because every reformer who has ever tried to change a system from inside, it has faced the same arithmetic. The system is always larger than the reformer. The institutional resistance is always more patient than any individual's tenure. The people who benefit from things as there will always outnumber and outlast any single person who believes things should be different. The only variable is time. And time, as Andropov understood better than almost anyone, is the one thing that cannot be requisitioned, cannot be filed for, cannot be extracted from any archive, no matter how complete. He knew what the country was. He knew what it needed. He had 15 months. It was not enough. The question is whether it ever could have been.